My friend Steve, who's a pastor over in South Bend, had the chance recently to travel to the Holy Lands. Now, I have not been there, so I can only report what his experience was, but he said there was a moment on his trip when they went to the city of Capernaum that was particularly striking. And he said, when you go to the city of Capernaum, you can go to the synagogue that Mark talks about in our gospel reading today, and its ruins go back to the 4th century, which is pretty late. That's after Jesus. But, he said, those ruins are built on top of much older foundations. And he said of his whole time in the Holy Lands, traveling around Israel, when they were in Capernaum and standing in the synagogue, he said that was the moment that he felt most connected to where Jesus was. He said, I knew in that moment I was standing in Jesus' footsteps. And that, for that moment, for me, was when I felt most connected to Jesus when he was walking on our earth. And he said that a second very striking thing about the synagogue there in Capernaum is that it's located only about 100 yards from the Sea of Galilee. So about 100 yards from the beach, where fishermen would sit all morning repairing their nets after a long night of fishing. And we remember that just last week, in just these previous verses of Mark, we heard about 4 professional fishermen, Simon and Andrew, James and John, who after a long night's fishing were sitting there on the beach at the Sea of Galilee, and they were repairing their nets when this stranger walked up to them. This stranger came to them and said, "Follow me, and I will make you fish for people." And it says that immediately, that is Mark's favorite word, by the way. I looked it up, and in 16 chapters, Mark says immediately 42 times. The Gospel of Mark, it just goes by at a breakneck pace. Everything is, and immediately, and immediately. And immediately, Simon and Andrew, James and John left behind everything, left behind their entire life's work to follow Jesus. And immediately, it says they went to Capernaum, and they went to the synagogue that is there, 100 yards from the beach. And I was trying to imagine what this would be like. I was trying to imagine these professional fishermen who were making a living, encountering this stranger on the beach, and who, with one word, one sentence, got them to abandon everything. And I wondered what it was about Jesus that would be so compelling to have them leave behind every way that they had known of making a living. There must have been something stunning about Jesus. He must have had a presence, that sort of personal authority in the way that he looked at them, that would cause them to cast their lot, to follow on and devote their lives to following behind him. That sort of authority that we see when Jesus starts to teach here and immediately in the synagogue. Because the Greek word is that the crowd is struck out of their senses at Jesus. In other words, their minds are blown at Jesus' authority. And I wondered about that. I wondered when we've experienced just a little taste of that kind of authority. And probably if you go through your memories, you can remember certain people who, when they spoke, were so compelling just because of who they were. The closest one I could think of in my own life was a couple years ago, a group I was part of. We invited the superintendent of the Indiana Women's Prison, whose name is Stephen McCauley, to come and meet with us. We were talking about the justice system in Indiana and and he was sharing with us what life is like to be an administrator in the prison. And he was a fascinating man, but I remember this moment when we asked him, so what's your hardest day there in the Indiana women's prison? And I remember so clearly he fell silent for a little bit and thought about it. He said, my hardest day is when I see one of our women walking out of the prison, and I know that until she gets back and gets rearrested, she's not going to sleep in a clean bed. And I know she's coming back because we've done nothing to help her succeed out there. And I remember his voice caught. His voice caught because he cared. He was bleeding for his people. And then a little bit later, I remember that he told us to come and speak with us. We offered him an honorarium. We paid him something for his time. And he sort of let slip accidentally that he was going to take that honorarium. And he decided to donate the entire thing to a nursery program that he had started in the prison for women who came to the prison who were pregnant. He wanted a program where pregnant women who gave birth while they're in prison could stay near their children. And he believed in it so much that he was going to donate his entire honorarium. And as he talked about what he saw in that program and what an effect it had on the women there, his voice caught. And I thought to myself, that is that kind of compelling authority. When you bleed for your people, you have that right to speak with authority. And so back in Capernaum, Jesus, speaking in the middle of the gathered faithful, has blown their minds because he teaches as though he knows God. And there into the middle of this assembly lurches Old Man Williamson. Now, Old Man Williamson was well known in the community. He was the one who would burst out with something, and everybody just sort of knew. You just kind of had to handle him with velvet gloves, and you ignored most of what he said. He was just that guy that all communities seem to have and that we get used to and we adapt to. Old Man Williamson, who's just sort of always on the periphery, always on the outskirts, but on this day he comes lurching into the middle of the assembled faithful there in the synagogue, and he starts shouting, screaming at the top of his lungs, trying to have authority over Jesus. "What have you to do with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us all? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." Now this is something different even for Old Man Williamson. The crowd was used to his outbursts, but this was different. And they waited with silent to see how Jesus would react. And Jesus simply says, did you notice this? "Hush now. Be silent. Come on out of there. Leave him alone." There are no incantations, no magic words, no calling on anybody else, no formula to follow, just Jesus speaking, and it happens. Jesus himself is authority enough to set us free from all the things that want to grab hold of us, all the things that want to control us. Jesus himself is authority enough in his own self to free us from our self-righteous anger, the greedy, grasping things that want to possess us, all of the pressure that tells us we need to do it all. Jesus is enough. and is all we need. Now, remember, there are these 4 guys lurking back on the outskirts of this synagogue. Simon and Andrew, James and John, who have just pitched in and devoted their lives to this stranger named Jesus. And immediately they've come up to the synagogue and they're standing there on the outskirts. And they don't know Jesus, and now they've heard him teach with authority. They've heard him preach and blow the minds of the crowd. They have been there and heard that old man start shouting, and they've watched as Jesus cast out this unclean spirit. They are watching all this happen. Can you imagine what was going through their minds? Imagine how they felt. I hear 2 different strands of reaction. The first is, yes! We picked the right guy. And the other one is, oh no, what have we gotten ourselves into? Right? Now for me, I think both of those reactions make a whole lot of sense. Because we are here because we've pitched in with Jesus. We are here because we've discovered in him a life that is abundant and cannot be found anywhere else. And as followers of Jesus, what that means for us is we've devoted our lives to learning from him how to live that abundant life that he offers. We have pitched in with Jesus to learn from him, and when we discover that Jesus is more than a moral checklist, that Jesus is more than just a good teacher, but when we discover that when Jesus looks at us, it is the creator and author of all things that looks back at us, when we discover that it's God who created galaxies that was in that manger, when we discover that when Jesus says, I love you, it is God Almighty who speaks, we ought to be delighted. We ought to be ecstatic. We ought to be saying, yes. God, the author of all life, is that authority that we have pitched in with. And this one that we follow, this man named Jesus, has his authority. He is the authority to save us, to set us free, to protect us, to redeem us, and to open up heaven for us and invite us in to spend forever with him. This is the Jesus that we meet at the table and who welcomes us in the water of baptism. We ought to be delighted. And because we follow Jesus, we are also under his authority. And the truth is, there's an awful lot of people and things out there that do not want us living under his authority. So here's an example, and think about this for a second. I've heard that there's a football game this evening. Have you heard this too? And during this football game, there's going to be some commercials. I've even heard that Dish Network has this new thing where they've, if you record the game and come back to it later, you can skip the game with a single button to just watch commercials. Have you heard this? And these commercials cost a ridiculous amount of money. I don't know what it is this year. Now think about this for a second. Think about the commercials you're going to watch that are going to air. And you tell me, how many of those commercials do you think are going to be dedicated to convincing us that we are good enough just the way we are? That's right, I'm with you. 0. And how many of those commercials do you think are going to be dedicated to teaching us how to live life so that it is abundant for all? I'll give them maybe one, but I don't know which one that is. And how many millions of dollars are they spending to convince us that who we are is not right? But if we just buy that right car, or drink that right beverage that has to do with puppies and horses for some reason, then, boy, then we're good enough until the next commercial comes on. And think about what would happen for those companies if all of God's faithful followers of Jesus, who are so beloved that he would die for us, imagine if we believed him. And all of God's faithful people said, no, I'm good enough because Jesus said so. What would happen? Imagine all of the voices that are out there that depend on us believing that we are not enough. Or the voices out there that rely on us being afraid. Think about how many things in our world are out there teaching us to be afraid of people who are different than us, especially. And think what would happen to their power if we believed Jesus and lived under his authority and said, no, Jesus said, I'm good. And that's all I need to know. There are voices, powerful voices out there, structures that exist so that do not want people to believe Jesus. And the battle is on. And Jesus says, hush now. That's enough. You come on out of there. You have no place in my world. We are here together today because in the waters of baptism, at this table around which we gather, in the words that Jesus speaks, and in the invitation he extends to follow him, to learn how to live in his abundant life. We are here because we have discovered in him authority. Jesus, who bleeds for his people, is the author of all life. And when Jesus says, I love you, when God speaks, it is so. And as followers of Jesus, we have that great privilege of living under his authority too. For he is teaching us what living in the light of heaven looks like here. And there are people you're going to see today who are not going to be happy about that. And people who are going to try to convince you that Jesus doesn't matter and that we should not be listening to him. Here's the thing. Jesus already won that battle. Jesus already blew the hinges off the doors of heaven. Jesus already has saved us. Jesus has already brought grace, God's mercy, and offers to us abundant life. Jesus has already given us everything. And as followers of him, under his authority and by his authority, we live in the light of heaven. And there are no voices. There are no spirits there are no structures, there are no commercials that can ever take us away from him. Jesus is our authority because that's who Jesus is. Thanks be to God.